In this tutorial, I'm going to quickly cover just some of the basics of digitally coloring something that was hand drawn. And so, for example, I've got a photograph here where I have some sort of colored planes that I've sort of laid into the image. We'll cover a little bit of the process of some of that, but also, and maybe more importantly, we'll cover how you might work with, say, a PNG file, which is just the black outline of your drawing, and sort of underlay all of the color underneath that. Similar to maybe how like a comic book key image sits on top of the inking or the coloring, right? So all this starts with drawing, right? So you gotta be working by hand in your sketchbook. It's probably not a bad idea to just kind of go back to the sketchbook drawing unit and just pick something that you were relatively comfortable with. This was our distorted plane project. Something like this, relatively quick and easy to do with a pencil, and then if we can get a nice digital version of it, can sort of provide really good exercise for digital coloring. So open that up into Photoshop. I have my Photoshop sort of preset to launch basically everything I put in it into Adobe Camera Raw. Adobe Camera Raw usually only opens up RAW files. This is like a pretty easy place just to do some basic slider adjustments for exposure and maybe a bit of clarity, but I'll just say this. Since this isn't really a Photoshop tutorial, if your image isn't really clear, isn't really well lit, just reshoot it. Go to a nice bright place, and we'll save the Photoshop tutorial, the sort of image correction tutorial for another time. Once we've got this image opened up into Photoshop proper, let's take a look at a couple things. First of all, layers. Make sure you have your layers palette open, Shift F7. And in your layers palette, do a Command J and duplicate the background layer. When we pull this image over into Camera Raw, what we're going to do is we'll pull it over just like it is right now. This is sort of the graphite version. It has a lot of grayscale values in it, lots of gray pixels. And then we're also going to perform a filter edit, filter gallery edit, in order to essentially strip away all of the details. So if you didn't see where I found that, that was up here in the way top options bar, the gray bar on top, and go to filter, filter gallery. And you may have to zoom out a little bit depending on the size of your image. Underneath our sketch filters, we've got a few in here that may work, something like photocopy, maybe stamp, maybe torn edges. And these are sort of like simple ways of thresholding or duotoning your image, basically blowing away all of the color detail, right? And you can increase or decrease the light-dark balance here to sort of pick up more or less detail in your line drawings. The more contrasty your original photograph, the easier and better these results are. And so if you didn't do your drawing in a nice soft pencil, this may not work as well. And if it's not lit really well, you might end up having these kind of big black cloudy messes around the sides. This is just an exercise though, so don't fuss over this too hard. Just get yourself the line work, right? And we're going to take this one step further even, where we're going to do our best to select out just the black lines. Go to Select, Color Range, and in here, we're going to eyedropper tool one of the black pixels in the image somewhere. Find something, be really careful to just get the black pixels. Don't get a gray pixel or a white pixel or anything. And this is essentially going to grab a hold of every black pixel. Now, I just kind of turned the fuzziness all the way up. It's sort of a way of increasing the tolerance of the selection, but since this is a duotone image, it's probably not really that big of a deal. Click OK, and you'll see, if I zoom in really, really close, you see how there's sort of like a little selection edge around each one of my black drawings, sort of a marching ants scrolling marquee looking thing. If I do a copy paste, Command C, Command V is the keyboard shortcut for that. It doesn't look like much happened, but if I turn off layer 1 and the background layer, you'll see that I pasted just the black line work into its own layer. The sort of gray and white checkerboard is Photoshop's way of saying there's nothing there. It's totally transparent. We'll be able to use this sort of like a comic book illustrator uses key images, just to sort of lay it on top of all the color. Now the last thing I'll just say, in case you really want to do this, is if you want to blow away some of this extra drawing junk, the eraser tool, not a tool I typically use in Photoshop, but go ahead and grab it from the toolbar, keyboard shortcut E. And since we're just working on a transparent background now, you could just kind of go through and blow out any sort of stray drawings that you don't need or don't want. Now, as you save this out in Photoshop, it is really critical that you do a file, save as, and be careful about which file type you choose. It'll default likely to a Photoshop file. That would work, but Photoshop files are pretty big, right? And so as we pull this over into Illustrator, let's keep our file sizes small. JPEG's pretty common, but JPEG doesn't maintain transparency. To get that, we need to save a PNG file. PNGs are, I think they're optimized for text actually, but they maintain transparency, and so when you save this guy, it will leave the sort of clear background intact. I'll show you what I mean here. If I open up the original, or just do a quick preview of the original graphite drawing, and then if I kind of scroll down here, here we go. Here is the PNG file. It's only the black line work. Jump into a brand new Adobe Illustrator file and drag and drop those files in from the desktop. Now, I've already got a couple of my images pulled in, but I'll just pull one in anyway. So say, for example, I want to get a hold of this PNG file. As you pull these images in, probably not a bad idea to embed them right away. Click the image, go up to your options bar here and click embed. If you don't have your control bar turned on, go to Window, Control. An embedded file won't walk away from you, won't lose it, won't become disconnected, so that as we're practicing with this stuff, you can, if you happen to move a file or save your Illustrator file somewhere else, at least the photographs will travel with you. This is going to be a pretty small document, so don't worry about the size. So take a look at the layers palette, right? I have my photograph in layer 1, and I'm going to lock that layer. And for this first experiment, I'm going to, I'll probably actually hand color the photograph, because let's just say, for example, like the PNG, the Photoshop stuff was a little over your head. But you can, you can at least comprehend how, say, for example, you might be able to just bring a photograph into Photoshop. That's totally legit. Let's work from here. This is going to be in a separate layer, and I put that layer on top of my photograph layer. So the photograph is in layer 1, and now all of my image tracings will go in to layer 3. Keyboard shortcut P, I'm going to use the pen tool, and of course looks like I'm tracing with no fill and no stroke. That's a little hard, so I'll come over to my toolbar, make sure the fill and stroke is turned on. Actually, I don't need a fill at the moment. I'll just go with the black line stroke. This is just going to kind of block out the panels, and so I kind of like this folded or distorted plane drawing exercise for this project, because the planes are pretty easy to trace out. They're all straight lines, but it would work the same way for curving and more complex forms. So now that I've got all 3 of these planes traced out, I'll select all 3 and give them some sort of fill. So stroke off, and I'll double click my fill option here, and I'll navigate down to a color that I kind of like. I'll go with sort of this soft yellow here. And because it's sort of underside, right, this underside should be probably a bit darker. I'll double click into my color picker and go a little bit darker and a little bit less saturated. That way it sort of has the illusion that it's sort of a shadow place, or like a shaded area. This looks okay, right? It's a little clunky. It kind of sort of looks like folded paper, but what I'm going to do is grab all 3 of those, right? And wouldn't it be great if I could kind of pick up some of the graphite detail underneath there? One of the ways you could do this, right, is just to lower the opacity, but then my yellows get really washed out, right? Instead of lowering the opacity, click on the word opacity, and we will manipulate the blending mode. So right here where it says normal in the little opacity box here, switch normal to multiply. Multiply is sort of a way for us to blend that color into the image, and now that I can sort of see what's going on, I might have to tweak and move around some of my anchor points a little bit. This is looking pretty good, right? So if you can imagine, doing that to one design, right, you could easily imagine tracing out multiple panels on multiple complex shapes, and assigning them all those color profiles. So that one is pretty straightforward, and it doesn't take much photoshopping, right, to get you there. It's obviously a little bit simplified, right? There's plenty more to do here with color, but let's jump over to something like our key image. Right? Our key image is sort of sitting on top of the colors. So the colors are now sitting behind the black lines. This is kind of handy in a sense, because we don't have to be quite as precise with our pen tooling. So let's jump over to one of these where I don't have any tracings done at all. And now I still have this layer, still have this image, right, stuck into layer 1. I'm going to lock out that layer, but now because I want my tracings to go behind the key image, behind these black lines, I'm going to put my tracings into layer 2. So I'll come back in with the pen tool and do the exact same sort of pen tooling here. But this time, all of my pen tooling is falling behind the black lines, and that's kind of handy because it prevents me from having to get too careful. This is actually very much the way early comic books used to be printed, and if you pick one up one time, take a careful look at some of the inking. I mean, it's not uncommon to see inking that's totally not registered correctly, or they're barely even fitted, but you know, it holds together pretty well. It's sort of a result of sort of the fast-paced, sort of low quality production of the comic book industry, but it actually has kind of a nice feel to it. I'm going to be a little more careful and make sure all my lines fit. I'm going to make sure that my sort of top and bottom pages here are slightly brighter and more saturated than the other side there. So same basic idea, but now the colors are actually sitting behind the black line, behind the key image. This is really handy because you can do things fairly easily, like add backgrounds to the whole design. Send this to the back here, right click, send to the back, and maybe shift the color scheme into something that sort of lives in the complementary area. How about a desaturated sort of purpley gray? Something like that. Right, so now I've got a background and a foreground here. That's kind of nice. This is the sort of basic idea behind, you know, hand coloring your designs. You owe me one of these things all built out in the computer, and then we'll actually spend a little more time thinking about, like, do you want to pursue the hand coloring with the watercolors, or do you want to pursue some of these digital colors? Before I go, let's actually talk one more time about how to actually build the sort of lightness and darkness in. So I talked earlier about actually kind of shifting the colors here, but what about actually adding a subtle gradient map? For that, I'm going to duplicate that shape that comes down, and I'll open up my gradient palette. Gradient palette is hiding underneath Window, Gradient, Shift F9, or Command F9. And in the gradient palette, I can assign this shape a gradient. It automatically defaults to being somewhat of a boring gradient, right? But you can kind of see if I stick this on top, it's starting to actually affect the layer underneath. That's really handy. Why don't I double click the white end of this spectrum and make that 0%. And so this way I'm actually kind of making it a clear layer. That way the sort of colors, the vibrant yellows, actually come through even more. And now I need to actually reassign the sort of direction or the angle of that gradient. So I'll stick it right on top, and by the way, since I copied it, it still has a multiply blending mode. That's why we're getting this nice kind of blending see-through. Now while I have that layer selected, if I grab onto my gradient tool, I can reassign the direction of that gradient and sort of apply sort of its strength. Right, so I can kind of angle it here to make sure that the lighting is roughly in the right spot, and give it the feel that this piece of paper here is actually being overhung. And I might actually do something similar on this one back here, because it also has a little bit of sort of overhang at the back. I'll make the white transparent. Grab the gradient tool and just sort of reassign that gradient until I sort of like the general sort of shading. Now this is one way of building a sort of color space into your drawings, and I sort of like it. I like it for a couple of reasons. One of them is I can simply just kind of move the gradient map away and do some color adjusting. If I realized, ooh, I wasn't actually so interested in this color, I needed to kind of tweak that, maybe bring that up a little bit, have a little bit more vibrancy, then bring the gradient maps back in. I don't have to do all of that color tweaking in the gradients themselves. Once I have the gradients set, I can just sort of leave it. Whichever way you like, there's a lot of different ways we can approach this kind of work in Illustrator. I look forward to kind of catching up with you guys in the studio and seeing how you approach this idea. Take it easy, guys.